Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today we've got quite a few new unique items coming. In fact, some of them are just coming soon, like Edyryn's Tusks, which we're going to be going over today. Let's talk about Edyryn's Tusks, and let's figure out what it could be useful for. So Edyryn's Tusk is an iron cuirass. That is a base that is strictly armor rating. Armor rating, of course, is your damage reduction for physical damage, not just physical damage from melee attacks or ranged attacks, but also physical damage from spells. It's just basically any physical damage that could potentially hit you. So if you are trying to stack as much armor as you can, then this base is an interesting one. Although it does forego things like evasion, obviously energy shield, and, that could be an issue. As you can see, this one requires level 11, and it has a strength requirement of 24, so not very high. If I hold down the Alt key here, you can see that it has 120 to 160% increased armor. It has 15 to 20 to 25 to 30, so it can go as high as 20 to 30 physical Thorns damage, which is kind of neat. It also has the 10% chance to inflict bleeding on hits, which is really nice. So basically just giving you the ability to bleed targets. And 50% reduced slowing potency of debuffs on you. So, I mean, first off, we have here, also at the bottom there, you see that the flavor text. Most of the items have flavor text, right? This one in particular doesn't have flavor text yet. It just says coming soon, which is kind of hilarious. This one in particular, it seems to be designed around a character who's stacking as much armor as you possibly can. And armor can obviously protect you against more than just simply physical damage, and we'll talk about that. The ability to bleed targets is something that is not unique, and it is something that you can potentially get in other places, so we can talk about that as well. It does, however, have a hefty amount of Thorns damage. Physical Thorns damage is what it calls it. And with Thorns damage, you can see it literally says you deal your Thorns damage to enemies that hit you with a melee attack. So it does have to be melee, which is unfortunate. I'm not really quite sure what I think about this one. It does have an interesting graphic as well. Let's go ahead and put the armor on us real quick, and you can see the graphic. As you can see, it's got like these big tusks sticking out of it all over the place. Looks like it would be horribly uncomfortable and cumbersome. Good luck getting through doorways. But, I mean, other than that, it looks kind of nice, except for the giant tusks sticking out of it. I guess that's where the Thorns part of this particular armor comes from. Essentially, those big giant tusks. Gonna hurt. You try and hit me. Yeah. Take that. It's definitely an interesting one for sure. Alright, so let's talk about the various things that you can potentially do with this armor. First off, it's obviously a armor that's designed for armor stacking. So one of the things that we can do here is we can take a look at armor. And when you search for armor on the board, I really wish the armor, the search option was, better than this. I swear, like, half the time you look at this stuff, and, I think I typed in armor wrong. It's not very obvious, sometimes. Sometimes it's extremely obvious, but other times not so much. In this particular case, you have 80% increased armor and evasion. There's tons of armor bonuses all over the board. Defend with 150% of your armor against attacks further than 6 meters. There's some pretty interesting ones that allow you to basically, like, convert all of your evasion rating into armor. If you're trying to stack as much armor as you possibly can. There's also some ways that you can potentially increase what your armor does. Like 25% of armor also applies to fire damage taken from hits. As you can see, like defend with 200% of armor against critical hits. 50% of base armor for equipment also adds to stun threshold. So if you were going to go with a stacking armor bonus, to try and get like those crazy high armor numbers, I mean, there are ways in here where you can use armor for more than just physical damage. There are ways that you can force it to mitigate portions of critical strikes and portions of fire damage. There are ways where you can even convert, like all of your evasion into armor. Down here, you'll see that you can even make it so that you get 1 evasion rating per 1 armor equipped on gloves, as well as 8% evasion rating as extra armor. It's kind of a crazy thing that you could do. Like, there's building into any specific like defensive mechanic, whether it's energy shield, whether it's armor, whether it's evasion, they all have their own specifics. Like this one is defend with 120% of armor while not on a low energy shield. I mean, it's kind of interesting like how many different options there are on the board for armor. This one right here is gain physical thorns damage equal to 2% of armor equipped from your body armor piece. So in this particular case, it builds into this because obviously this is a thorns piece designed to obviously dish out thorns damage. And then this is going to stack on top of that because they gave you a full body armor piece. And so you're going to get 2% of the armor as thorns. So that's also nice. Overall, though, like if you go through the board and you're looking for specific bonuses, you're probably going to be able to find something close. In this particular case, obviously the armor is set up for thorns, so let's take a look at thorns. So let's just type in thorns. And as you can see, we have 16% thorns damage. We've got that one that increases our thorn spiral body armor, thorns critical strike chance, interesting, critical strike damage bonus. We've got 40% increased thorns here, here, and here. So there's a lot of places where you could potentially enhance the thorns bonus, which isn't bad. I'm trying to see if I can find any more thorns bonuses. Of course, it may also... Oh, here we go, over here. So here's a nice little one. 75% increased thorns damage if you've blocked recently. Okay. And this one has to do with block chance and whatnot. This one also increases your armor if you've been hit recently, and your attack speed if you've been hit recently. So a lot of various things you can do across the board there for your thorns. But that's not the only thing that this armor does. It also inflicts bleeding. Now, bleeding is not like a unique effect. And if you type in bleed in the panel, you'll find that there's a lot of ways that you can potentially add bleeds into your build. You can have 5% increased chances to inflict bleeds. Obviously, you can also make the magnitude of the bleed higher. You can also create chances where they aggravate the bleed, which basically means it does double damage. These are just some of the ways, but as you can see here, we got what, 5, 10, 15, 20. That's like 20% chance for bleeding right there. There's another 5% here, so that's 25. We've got another one that's 30. Then we have another 10 here, so that's 40% chance to bleed. As you can see, if you continually stack the bleeding modifiers and you were to go across the board and look for them, you can get a lot of bleeding modifiers and a lot of bleeding magnitude. Like here's another 5% chance. Here's another 5% chance. So that's what, 50% now we're up to. Another 5, that's 55, and so forth and so on. There's another 5, that's 60. It's certainly not impossible to get basically nearly a 100% chance to apply bleed to a target, especially if you look around the passive tree and through equipment and whatnot. There's some more. Look, there's 5, 10, 20, there's 5, 10, 12, 15, so that's 25. So that's another 45 added to the like 50 that we had over here, so that's like 95% bleeding. Obviously you're not going to be able to snag all of it, but there's definitely a large amount of bleeding as well as magnitude. There's even some bonuses, like this one is just a 5% bonus, but it also gives you magnitude and gives you a bonus to your attack speed or your attack damage as well as your accuracy against bleeding targets. So that's also interesting. And I think the kind of the goal around this is it's trying to set you up so that, number one, obviously the monsters are hitting you and they're taking thorns damage. And number two, you're also inflicting bleeding on them at the same time, which I'm not entirely sure if the bleeding applies through the thorns. That's an interesting question to ask. 50% reduced potency of slowing debuffs on you is kind of nice too. It basically just makes it so you don't get slowed as much. It's an odd one for sure. I mean, it's very specific. It's obviously thorns and it's obviously bleeding. I wouldn't necessarily go too heavy into the bleeding part with this particular piece of equipment. There may be better pieces of equipment for bleeding. One in particular, like if you were just looking for bleeding, I remember I did a video on this a little while back. It's a armor piece that gives you the chance to aggravate bleeding on targets. Yes, this one. Bleeding that you inflict is aggravated, which is basically means that all of the bleeding that you ever do with this particular body piece will be aggravated on the target. And aggravated, as you can see here, says bleeding has been aggravated is always treats the target as moving and dealing 100% extra damage. So if you're going for a bleeding build, aggravated bleeding is literally just a double bonus on your damage output. And so while this one it does have bleeding on it, if I were building a bleeding build, I would probably want to go with Apron of Emiram just so I can get 100% uptime on aggravation. Aggravation also applies to monsters when they move while bleeding, which is also another thing. So if the monster is moving around while they're bleeding, then they automatically become aggravated. It's it really just depends on what's going on with your character. But like if you're able to make the monsters move all the time, then you don't necessarily need this. But it definitely would be a better one, I think, for bleeding than the other. This one seems to be more based around Thorns itself, and like somehow secondarily adding in some bleeding to your Thorns. I'm assuming that maybe Thorns applies on the bleeding, which is or bleed applies on the Thorns hit, I would think. Not entirely sure though. We can always go out and let a monster hit us and see if the bleed effect actually does land on them. I mean, are any of these guys bleeding? I mean, they should technically be taking damage at the very least from the Thorns, which it does look like they are, but I'm not entirely sure that they're bleeding. Now he's bleeding. So I'm going to have to say the answer to that question is no, because they're definitely not getting the bleed effect on them just from the Thorns. Let the wolfie wail on me and see if he will bleed. Bite one of my horns with your teeth, and when you're finished biting, you can go home. I don't want to kill you back to Rome. Rotten wolfie, what do you do? Do you gotta take a number 2? Rotten wolfie, him's real mean. They're gonna bite me in my spleen. Sharp little daggers on my armor, sir, and you take lots of damage when you play with my fur. Okay, I think we can. I think we can clearly say that the Thorns is not applying the bleed. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, you wouldn't still get the bleed for attacking the targets, but it's just an interesting thing to think about, is that maybe the Thorns could apply the bleed, which it is not. So, neither here nor there. I think that's pretty much it with this item. The flavor text is still coming soon. So, yeah. I'm not entirely sure if I wanted to, like, build a character around this. I'm not really, like, too big on Thorns. I have done a couple Thorns characters on various games, but I think this is the, I think I'm more interested in the other builds. Anyway, if you enjoy the content, please be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button. And as always, keep watching.